I animated myself in Demon Slayer, and it was the biggest project I've ever worked on. From the complex character design, to the detailed animation, to the colorful compositing, every part of the process pushed me to my creative limits, and it took me 1 month to complete. But taking all this time was worth it, because it made the animation so much better. Today I'm going to explain how I animated myself in Demon Slayer by going through all the steps of my creative process. First, I had to make my character design, and the reason why I do this before starting the animation is to keep my character consistent throughout the entire project. It also helps to clearly show the important details early on, so that I won't lose any time during the animation stage trying to remember or guess what something looks like. So in order to make this design, I drew my character in the front view and the side view so that I can accurately draw every detail from different angles later when animating the movement. For the clothes, I took inspiration from the Demon Slayer corpse outfit, since in this universe, I am a Demon Slayer too. I especially looked at Sanemi and Tanjiro's clothes for ideas, combining elements from both of their outfits. I also decided to add the cape because it makes me look more like a warrior, and I wanted to make sure I don't look too much like Tanjiro, so adding differences like this was important. For the color choice, I went with blue for my upper clothes and a darker shade of blue for my pants to keep the look cohesive. To add some strong contrasts and to make the design pop, I made the cape a vibrant orange. As you can see, the design is not extremely detailed, but it's also not too simple either. The goal here is just to draw the important details so that I don't forget anything when I'm animating. For example, I added these little wavy lines here, and I also added glasses, which are important details for the character. However, I don't need to make the shading extremely detailed at this stage. It's more about the structure and the essentials. I also use this Akaza design reference to help me make sure I get the right anatomy proportions for my character, because Akaza's hair is pretty similar to the kind of look I want. But for mine, the hair will be shorter and a little bit fluffier. For Tanjiro's design, I used 2 pictures which are the official character design sheets, and I did the same thing with Nezuko. And with that said, my Demon Slayer design is finally completed, and I think it looks pretty good, so we can now start planning the animation. When making an animation, we can't just start animating without a plan, otherwise the scene can end up looking messy or inconsistent. I wanted to make sure the animation would look as good as possible, so I asked my friend for advice, and he had an amazing idea. We decided to film ourselves fighting with swords. My friend will explain why.
The reason why we did this was to gather some useful references for swordplay movements and timing, because using real-world references is always helpful for making animations feel more natural and fluid. In the video, we performed a lot of different poses and experimented with various movements like spinning, swinging, blocking, and even dodging. We made sure to exaggerate some actions a little to better match the style of the anime.
With that footage, I was able to study the flow of the motion and the timing of each strike, which really helped when designing the animation. After gathering all that material, I moved on to making a short storyboard. This step is crucial because it shows every cut, every scene transition, and gives a clear blueprint for the animation. I experimented with different dynamic poses and angles by using the reference I made with my friend, adjusting them to make them look even more dramatic and impactful. This way, I could plan the entire sequence and make sure the action scenes would be as smooth as possible. So here's what the cuts for the fight animation are going to look like. Keep in mind, this is just for the fight sequence. I will add a few more cuts before the fight starts to build up the tension and set the scene. In the first cut, we see Tanjiro with an angry, determined expression on his face. He then pulls his sword and runs towards me as the camera follows him. As he gets close, I will block his attack at the last moment and counter by kicking him in the stomach, sending him backwards. In the second cut, Tanjiro will recover by quickly doing a backflip to create distance. As he lands, he'll spin his sword, which will look very cool. Then he'll use his water breathing technique, and the water effect will start to appear around his blade. And then he will charge forward again, this time coming directly towards the camera to make the viewer feel the intensity of the attack. For the third cut, we'll see a fast-paced close-up of me and Tanjiro clashing swords and fighting at close range. Here I'll take a lot of inspiration from the reference footage I filmed with my friend to make the combat feel more alive and realistic. The fourth cut will show Tanjiro's sword getting blocked by my sword. In the sixth cut, Tanjiro will hit a wall and drop his sword on the ground, but in the seventh cut, he will take his sword and use his fire attack Hinokami Kagura. I will then add a lot of flames and a lot of speed. Now that we have the character design and the storyboard, we can do the longest and hardest part, which is the animation. Usually when I do the animations, I don't make the background at the beginning, I focus mainly on the characters first. But this time, my friend gave me a useful piece of advice. He suggested creating a simple background early on, just to know where the characters are going to be in the scene. The background doesn't need to be complicated at this stage. It can be something as basic as perspective lines that show the motion of the camera and help guide the action. For example, in the first cut, I drew a curved line so that when I pan the camera, it looks like the angle is changing, even though it's actually just a 2D image. Adding this simple background early helps a lot, especially for making the character movement and the camera transition feel more intentional. When it comes to making the actual drawings, the most important thing is to keep everything simple. The goal is to break down the body into basic shapes to make the animation process much easier and faster. For example, when designing the clothes, I used a lot of triangular shapes to create sharp, dynamic folds. For the face and other body parts, I mainly rely on circle and ovals to build the structure. These simple shapes are really important because they allow me to simplify complex anatomy and movement, making it way easier to draw the characters consistently from different angles. It's a fundamental technique that helps maintain good proportions and keep the animation clean and readable, even during fast action scenes. Now it's time to move on to the most time-consuming step of the process, which is the line art. The reason why this part takes so much time is mainly because Tanjiro is a very detailed character. His earrings are detailed, his belt has a lot of complex parts, and the patterns on his clothes are not easy to draw consistently. However, since this is a fight animation with a lot of movement, I can simplify certain elements depending on the situation. For example, if Tanjiro is far away from the camera, I don't need to draw all the details on his earrings. A simple shape will be enough, because the viewer won't even notice at that distance. To make sure the lines stay clean and sharp, I use the pixel brush, which is the thinnest brush available on Flip-A-Clip. It helps create a precise line that makes everything look cleaner. I also took advantage of the tools to speed up the process. For example, I used the circle tool to draw smooth curves for the blades, and the box tool to help make Tanjiro's rectangular earrings perfectly shaped. One of the trickiest part was drawing the pattern on Tanjiro's cloth, because the squares have to follow the curves and fold of the fabric. It's really important to pay attention to that, since if the pattern doesn't match the motion of the clothes, it can look strange or off. As long as you follow the folds and keep the pattern consistent frame by frame, it will look good and natural. This is also why it's super important to keep checking the character design sheet during the process. I actually made some mistake at first, like accidentally adding too many squares to the pattern on Tanjiro's jacket. But because I kept referring to the character design, I noticed it early and was able to fix it. If I hadn't double checked, I might have had to redo a huge part of the animation later on, which would have wasted a lot of time. For the line art of my character, I chose to make it a little less detailed compared to Tanjiro. This small difference creates a bit of visual contrast and also helps keep the focus on the action. If you zoom in on my character, you'll notice that I didn't draw the ears in an extremely detailed way, and I kept the ends quite simple too, especially when my character isn't super close to the camera. I applied the same logic when Tanjiro gets pushed backward and is far away from the viewer. It's okay to simplify the design. Doing this gives me more time and energy to focus on what really matters: the movement, the poses, and the overall feeling of the fight. Also, during this step of the animation, I decided to add more frames in specific parts to make the motion feel even better. You see, the animation is mostly animated on 2s, meaning that each drawing lasts for 2 frames. This is a common technique because it saves time and still looks smooth. However, I wanted some parts to feel even smoother and more impactful, so I switched to 1s in certain moments, which means 1 drawings for every frame. For example, when Tanjiro spin his sword, I added extra frames and animated it on 1s to make the spinning motion look fluid and fast. Also, whenever the characters are swinging their sword, those frames are always animated on 1s to emphasize the speed and weight of the attacks. On the other end, after the sword impact, the movement slowed down a bit, and for those frames I sometimes animated them on 3s. This slight slowing down right after the hit makes the impact feel heavier and gives a nice speed contrast between fast and slow moments. Creating this contrast is important because it helps to make the action feel dynamic and alive rather than flat and robotic. At the very end of the animation, when Tanjiro dashes toward the camera, I wanted to create a smooth slow motion effect, but also keep the sense of speed at the same time. To do that, I animated that sequence entirely on ones, which makes the motion extremely fluid and intense, especially combined with some dramatic camera movements. Now that the line art is done, it's time to do the colors. Coloring can be a little tricky because before you can even start filling in the colors, you have to make sure all the lines are properly closed. If there are any tiny gaps, the color will spill outside the drawing. When it comes to choosing the right colors, it's always a good idea to use a reference. For example, I kept looking at this image because it had the mood I wanted. But of course, you don't have to follow the original colors exactly. You can adjust them a little bit to fit your style or the mood of the scene. For the shading, it's important to remember that you don't have to shade everything in every frame. If a character is far away from the camera, or if you're working on tiny details like Tanjiro's earrings, just using the base color is fine. Adding complex shading in every little corner would be a waste of time and wouldn't even be noticeable to the viewer at that distance. So it's smarter to focus on the shading efforts where it really matters, like during close-ups or important poses. Since Tanjiro's clothes are very detailed, I made the shading process easier by adding the shadows on the separate layers. Doing this allows you to be more flexible. You can adjust the opacity, make the shadow smoother, and even add a soft outline, which will make the shadow softer, without affecting your first layer. It's a really efficient method, especially for a complicated character like Tanjiro, who has a lot of folds and patterns on his outfit. Since my character also has pattern in his design, I did the same thing since it saves time and looks better. For this animation, there will be two stages of compositing. The first stage is done on Flip-a-Clip, and the second one will be completed later in Premiere Pro. For the Flip-a-Clip compositing, I started by duplicating the animation layer, then I changed the blending mode to color dodge. After that, I use a black airbrush to erase the darker areas. By doing this, the lighter parts of the drawing become even brighter, which creates a beautiful glowing effect, especially on parts like the sword or the skin. If you want to push the effect even further, there's another trick you can use. You can duplicate the layer again, but this time set the blending mode to multiply. With the multiply layer active, I used an airbrush to erase the areas where the light is. This way the shadows look stronger without making the whole scene too dark. It adds more depth to the character and helps separate the bright parts from the shaded areas. For the environment, I made it on Procreate and took a lot of inspiration from the Infinity Castle and also from traditional Japanese fences and architecture in general. To build the background, I first drew a wall design and then I duplicated it multiple times to create different architecture. I used the perspective tools to adjust the walls and make sure they look natural, like actual buildings stretching into the distance. By playing with the angle and size, it gave the background a much stronger sense of depth. Another important thing I did was separate different parts of the background onto different layers because it will allow me to create a 3D parallax effect where the foreground and the background layers will move at different speeds, making everything feel much more alive and dynamic. I also made a bridge in different angles because this is where the characters are going to be standing and fighting. Now I have all the backgrounds and I will make the second compositing stage. Once the backgrounds and effects were ready, it was time to work on the editing and the second compositing stage. This is where I put everything together. The backgrounds, the character animation, the lighting effects, and even the extra elements like water and fire attacks. I imported all the layers into Premiere Pro and made sure they match the character animation with the background and the VFX. Then I added the shadows under the character, which were done in Flip-a-Clip, and I added a blur effect to the shadow and lowered the opacity. For the water, I duplicated the layer and blurred it, then changed the blended mode to the color dodge to make the color pop. I slightly adjusted the brightness, contrast, and colors to make everything feel more cinematic. After doing all of that, I decided to add some additional cuts at the beginning of the animation to build more tension before the fight actually starts. I thought it would make the story feel more complete and give more weight to the battle. First, I made a new cut of Tanjiro and Nezuko walking together. At first, they looked a little too happy and relaxed, which didn't match the atmosphere. Since they're supposed to be alert and cautious, I went back and changed their facial expressions to make them look more serious and focused.
The reason behind the change is because they are in the Infinity Castle. I might have forced Sammy here to go back and change it after telling him very kindly.
Then I added a few cuts of me and Tanjiro talking before the action starts. I kept the movement simple, focusing on their expression and small motions to keep the pacing tight without slowing things down too much. Finally, I animated a cool moment where Tanjiro sensed the danger coming from my sword. I really wanted this scene to feel intense, so I added a lot of frames. For this final step, I used voice clip from the Demon Slayer anime to bring even more life to the animation. The voices don't exactly match the lines I wrote in the script, but they capture the emotion and feeling I wanted for these scenes, which is the most important thing. Honestly, I could have used the voice of any Hashira, but I choose Giyu because there's a similar scene in the first episode of Demon Slayer where he gets mad at Tanjiro. After that, I made subtitles that matched the script I had written, syncing them with the animation and the voice clips. And with that, the animation was finally complete. This project has been the biggest and most challenging thing I've ever worked on, but I'm really proud of how it turned out. Also, this was my first video using a professional mic, and it's also the longest video, which took over 2 hours of recording my voice. It wasn't easy, but seeing it all come together is very satisfying. I hope you guys will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed creating it. So here's the final result.
Oh. 奪うか奪われるかの時に主導権を握れない弱者が何の権利も選択肢もない。
鬼は俺の妹なんです。俺が家を留守にしている時に襲われ。
承知千万。生殺与奪の権を他人に握らせるな。惨めったらしくうずくまるのはやめろ。
妹は鬼になったけど人を食ったことはないんです。これからも人を傷つけることは絶対にしません。逃げろネズコ。全集中。水の呼吸。